The new 2021 Ritchey Ascent is an adventure bike that draws elements from gravel, mountain, and even touring bikes, but it deviates far enough to fall squarely into any existing category. It's unique in many ways, yet it's unmistakably a Ritchey steel frameset. Wedging itself between already narrow niches spanning the spectrum of cycling genres, this adventure seeker sits somewhere between a gravel bike and a mountain bike, but is itself neither. In this video, we'll get a close look at the newest adventure frameset from Ritchey, and I'll offer my thoughts on the bike, having ridden it for about 150 miles or so. And for the record, I haven't watched Russ's Ascent video yet. Now, we did test the exact same bike, so I figured it'd be best if my video was purely based on my own experiences to give you, the viewer, two totally independent reviews. I have to say though, it was pretty hard not to watch his video since it keeps popping up on my YouTube homepage. So this is actually the third iteration of the Ascent, and in its latest release, the Ascent preserves the geometry of the previous iteration, but adds a lot of modern accommodations like boost hub spacing, through axles, routing for full cable housing, and more plentiful mounting options. However, it's no longer offered as a breakaway frameset like its predecessor. Consistent with the modern trend of wider tires, it increases clearance from 2.1 to 2.6 inches wide for 27.5-inch wheels, but interestingly, for the larger wheel option, the stated clearance goes from 700C by 40 millimeters to 29 by 2.6 inches or 66 millimeters, adopting the 29-inch notation generally reserved for mountain bikes. Now, you might say that this hints at the Ascent's propensity for off-road use, although it could be argued that 700C by 66 just looks weird in print. So what is it? The Ascent is hard to define, that's for sure. It's neither a gravel bike nor a mountain bike, and while the cynics may dismiss the new Ascent as a rebranded 90s mountain bike, they would be overlooking the many nuances that differentiate this bike from its older relatives. Now, frankly, the similarities essentially end with the steel fork and the straight steer tube. Now, in my experience, I've found that a satisfactory description for the new Ascent is a mountain touring bike. Although, admittedly, ruminating over definitions of this bike has proven to be a pretty pointless exercise. It's a fun, versatile adventure bike for the masses, regardless of its label. Now, officially, it's branded as a do-it-all adventure bike, but it does seem to be biased for off-road use, adopting mountain bike standards like post-mount disc tabs and a 73mm bottom bracket shell. Further, many of the design elements serve to prioritize strength over reducing weight. For instance, the steel fork is built tough and somewhat stiff, but the benefit, of course, is that it doesn't impose a cargo weight limit on the fork legs like the carbon adventure fork featured on the Ascent's more gravel-oriented sibling, the Outback. Now, I should address this particular build before I go any further, because this build certainly is a sight to behold. Humbly labeled the Media Bike by Ritchey, this thing has some seriously cool American-made parts on it. From the Paul Clamper mechanical disc brakes and levers, to the White Industries bottom bracket and cranks, to the fully custom carbon rims laced to Philwood hubs, this thing really is a rolling showcase of blingy, domestically machined parts. Now, on this build in flat bar mode, the bike weighs just about 25 pounds, so it's not a lightweight bike compared to a typical performance gravel bike, but with this bike, it's all a matter of perspective. 25 pounds is pretty light for a mountain bike. Now, one thing I really liked was the thummy shifter adapter made by Paul Components, which allows you to convert a regular bar end shifter to a thumb style shifter for flat bars with no other modifications. And then, of course, the Rene Tandem Ridge tires in 650B by 55mm set up tubeless really made for a pretty plush ride. And then to tie it all together was Russ's purple cable cherries made by Forager Cycles, one of which I actually lost when I crashed and fractured my shoulder blade. Not to worry though, I healed up fine in a couple of months' time and the bike was totally unscratched. That's the important part, right? Shoot, I still owe Russ a cable cherry. Anyways, of course the big question is, how does it ride? Now, during the testing period, I rode about 150 miles, covering lots of SoCal fire roads, single track, and a bit of pavement thrown in for good measure. I rode the bike configured with drop bars, which were the Ritchey Venture Max bars in 42cm width, as well as flat bars, which were the Ritchey Coyote bars, uncut at 800mm. Worth noting is that the Coyote flat handlebars sweep pretty far forward before sweeping back, which allows the same stem to be used, and it keeps a pretty comfortable reach in either configuration. Now, when testing bikes, I find it challenging to delineate between the handling and the feel. Now, while the bike's handling is partially affected by the cockpit setup, like saddle and handlebar position, I think it's predominantly attributed to the frame geometry, which on the Ascent is relatively relaxed. The long chainstays at 463mm are 30 to 35 millimeters longer than the typical road-inspired gravel bike, which translates to a very stable rear end. Now, consequently, hard out-of-saddle efforts aren't reciprocated with the sense of instantaneous acceleration, and the bike just isn't as flickable as zippier gravel bikes. Now, the handling of the Ascent can most accurately be described as stable and relaxed, which is appreciated on fast, chunky descents where the bike really comes alive. Now, I don't know quite how to explain it, but because the bike rides like a mountain bike in a number of ways, I found myself letting off the brakes a lot more and really letting it fly on the downhills, even though psychologically I felt like I was riding a gravel bike. It was a really interesting phenomenon and really fun to experience. Now, getting a little bit more technical, the head tube angle for the medium frame that I tested is 70.5 degrees, and combined with the fork brake of 52 millimeters and the 55 millimeter wide tires, corresponded to a calculated trail of about 69 millimeters, which is on the higher end for a gravel bike, but considered pretty low for a modern mountain bike. Again, remember, the Ascent falls somewhere in between. Now, in drop bar mode, this contributed to a sense of stability when navigating fast descents, but surprisingly, I didn't experience too much front-end wandering during climbs, which is often cited as a drawback of excessive trail. Now, the wide Coyote handlebars likely had something to do with the control while in flat bar mode, but even in drop bar mode, I felt that the climbs were more taxing on my legs and lungs, and not so much on my arms. Now, whereas the handling of a bike refers to how the rider's input corresponds to the bike's trajectory, the feel of the frame, I think, is a distinct property altogether and has more to do with the frame material and manufacturing process. Now, straight gauge steel tubing has a constant wall thickness across the length of the tube, which is cheap to manufacture, but it can result in a harsh ride. Whereas butted tubing employs thinner walls toward the middle of the tube, offering more flex and compliance. All Ritchey frames are made from butted steel tubes, which in principle contribute to the rider comfort, as the flexible tubes serve to convert vibrational energy into heat before it ever reaches your body. Importantly, size-specific tubing is also used on Ritchey frames and is supposed to yield a more consistent ride feel across the range of sizes. Now, for example, the down tube on a small frame isn't just a large frame's down tube chopped down in length. Now, this would of course change the butting profile and affect the feel of the small frame. And while we do know that the tubes employ strategic butting, the precise nature of the butting profile is all part of what Tom Ritchey refers to as the secret sauce, and we don't know too much else about it. Now, on a related note, I think it was Keith Bontrager who famously said of bike parts, "Strong, light, cheap, pick two." Now, in the case of the Ascent, it's worth noting that despite the use of butted tubing, it certainly doesn't claim to be a lightweight bike. Now, I believe the Ascent, or at least the fork on the Ascent, has to adhere to ISO mountain bike testing standards, so it focuses more on strength and durability rather than minimizing weight. So I suppose for the Ascent, Ritchey chose strong and cheap, relatively speaking, and sacrificed a bit on light. All Ritchey frames use straight 1 1/8 steer tubes, rejecting the modern trend toward tapered head tubes, basically claiming that the average adventure seeker won't benefit from the increase in stiffness offered by a tapered head tube. Now, while it's impossible to attribute the feel of a bike to a single variable, the straight steerer on the Ascent did perhaps offer a bit of compliance in the front end, with no notable brake judder due to excessive flex in the crown area of the fork. Now, interestingly, Ritchey frames that feature a carbon fork, like the latest Outback, also use a straight steer tube, which highlights a different design element. Now, according to a source at Ritchey, the choice to incorporate straight steer tubes also stems from the fact that a tapered head tube would require a larger diameter down tube with which to mate. Now, this would pose a weight penalty and could potentially overstiffen the frame, neither of which would be desirable. Now, when considering that a larger down tube would need to be, quote, beer can thin to reduce weight and to preserve compliance, Ritchey says that it just doesn't make sense for their frame offerings. All of this to say, while the Ascent was certainly a smooth riding bike, it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. Now, of course, many variables contribute to the feel of the bike, but perhaps most notably is the choice of tire, which can be a challenging variable to eliminate when evaluating bike frames. Now, while not directly related to the Ascent, I recently tested the Outback with the same wheel and tire setup that I used on my carbon Specialized Diverge, theoretically isolating the effect of the frame set. Now, even though the geometries were rather different, I still felt that the Outback offered a pleasant and surprisingly muted feel overall, which did seem to take the edge off the constant high-frequency, low-amplitude chatter characteristic of gravel roads. Now, of course, this was not a blind test, and further testing would be required to isolate the Ascent with respect to others, but perhaps it's equally valid to zoom out a little bit and consider a more holistic picture of the frameset. Now, it wasn't the lightest or fastest bike I've ever ridden, but I can say with certainty that the Ascent was a really fun bike to ride. Now, again, it really came into its own during fast, chunky descents, and after the impulse to define the bike eventually waned, I started to just appreciate the smoothness built into the frameset, especially after long miles over rough terrain. Now, I would say that the only downside might be that the frameset is slightly weighty, but I think that most adventure-seeking bike packers could probably care less, and they would certainly value the peace of mind of having a strong, bomb-proof frame over saving a few grams. So who is this bike for? Again, that's a tough one, but I would say that the new Ascent is for budget-minded adventure seekers who want an off-road biased touring or bikepacking rig with all the mounting options and doesn't mind that it's not the lightest or fastest bike out there. Now, I would bet that the owner of the new Ascent has probably done a lot of research and weighed several options, but ultimately chose the Ascent due to its balance of thoughtful design, its practical features like plentiful mounts and external cable routing, and its relatively low price tag. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the new Ascent, definitely head over to Ritchey's website. You can just click the link down in the description, and also let me know what you think of the new Ascent down in the comments. And if you own a new Ritchey Ascent, let us know how you like it, how you built yours up, and why you chose it. Also, if you want to read more, the Ritchey Ascent is featured in the spring 2022 issue of Bicycle Quarterly with articles written by Heine, Fergus, Tanaka, and myself. Pretty cool, huh? I put a link down in the description if you want to order your own copy. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for this one. All in all, the Ascent is a super fun, versatile adventure bike that really shines on fast, chunky downhill stuff, and I had a great time riding it. Thanks for watching, and thanks again for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.